All right, thank you for staying with Daybreak. We're still talking about the Africa Climate Summit, the outcomes of it, all the hits and the misses, what more needs to be done going forward. But let's see what you're saying here. Trevor Mbija at Citizen TV Kenya, use the hashtag Daybreak. Let's read a few of them really quick before we continue this issue around the resource flow and reorganization of the funding that's coming towards the nations that need it the most. Honorable Lilian Sioi says the historic adaptation of the Nairobi Declaration is expected to point out Africa's position on climate change, climate financing, solutions to climate change, and how Africa plans to tackle climate issues. Okay? Let's see what else you're saying here. Engineer Nazaro says, as per panelists, why only African nations are so aggressive about the climate mitigations? Are we more vulnerable than other continents, or are we just championing the adaptations on behalf of the whole world? Okay? Bobo Tieno Wino says, can the panelists kindly explain to us the meaning of taxation of carbon, which President William Ruto stressed on to enable African continent to unlock resources to drive investment and finance green energy? Okay? We'll speak about that in just a bit. You continue to say, the just concluded Africa Climate Summit hits was at least we secured USD 23 billion to help climate change mitigation efforts, and the misses, of course, we had dissenting voices from civil societies who were complaining of lack of inclusivity. Let me bring in back and Dr. Kariuki on this. We're talking about the resource flow. Where's the challenge mostly? Because you are also involved in funding different aspects of it all. In fact, Cecilia was talking about how then do we ensure that the young people initiatives are funded directly?
Okay, let me address the issue of international flow of climate finance.
Yeah.
In 2019-2020, there was a total of climate finance, global climate finance amounting to $553 billion. Of that, only $29.5 billion came to Africa, so which is about 4.5%. At the same time, if you look at East Asia, where you have the likes of Japan and China, they accounted for 47% of those resources, which obviously means that the people who need the most, in particular Africa, as I said earlier, it accounts for the bulk, 90% of the top 10 most vulnerable countries, and also the continent that bears the brunt of climate finance got the least finance, which is a paradox. And the way I look at it is this: it's a function of the global climate finance architecture, which is heavily skewed, as Cecilia correctly put it, on mitigation, because that's where the resources are going. And it's because adaptation is not perceived to be commercially viable. And so what we've decided as a bank is to focus on adaptation. The UN Secretary General called for parity between adaptation and mitigation by 2020. I'm very pleased to note and proud to note that we were the first multilateral development bank to achieve parity in 2018. And we've since increased our commitment towards adaptation to 67% in 2021 and 63% in 2022, which means that we are focusing our resources in the area that is most relevant for Africa, because what we want to address are things that affect the changes that have happened. You know, when we talk about adaptation,
yeah,
you know, it's important to describe it in manners that people understand. For example, Cecilia talked about food insecurity. That we need to address. How can we address the issue of food insecurity? That's an adaptation measure. If we are told that we will have rising sea, so which means we have to build walls to protect low-lying areas, that is adaptation. When we have to look for water, we live in a water-scarce area. So if we have to do desalination or drilling of boreholes, that's adaptation. When we have to move from using firewood okay, to using clean sources of energy, that's adaptation. So I think for us, as a bank, those are areas that are genuinely germane to the continent, and that's why our focus is largely on adaptation.
Okay.
I think let me stop there.
All right, Cecilia, so what do we do from here now? Because we already know what the issues are, but we seem to be locked in a game of musical chairs. We're just going round and round and round.
Yes, indeed, Trevor. I think that one of the missing pieces, and this will be really the centerpiece of COP28, will be around what we're calling the global stocktake. And the global stocktake will be looking backwards and assessing where are we collectively as a world in addressing the climate challenge. And where we are seeing huge gaps is in the area of means of implementation. So the Paris Agreement lays out 3 elements: adaptation, mitigation. But having addressed that, we realized that there was a huge gap in terms of capacity, in terms of finance, and also in terms of technology transfer. But let me address the climate finance piece and build on what Dr. Kariuki is saying. I think for me, there are 3 fundamental issues. Having worked at a country level and supported countries in their efforts through whether it's NDCs or whether it's national adaptation plans, it took a country like Botswana, for instance, to unlock $2 million. $2 million, basically enough perhaps to build a rural bridge or a rural, to transform a small acreage into an irrigation space. It took them 5 years to unlock $2 million.
5 years.
5 years. So the whole issue of access, the whole issue of adequacy, because that can only deal with a problem maybe of one agricultural harvest period and not a continuous 5-year period of supporting small-scale farmers to be able to be productive. And that's where we are seeing the gaps. So there are responses that are coming, the financing flows that are coming to address the issues that are fundamentally affecting smallholder farmers is not adequate. It's not accessible. Why does it take 5 years to unlock $2 million, to do this? So access and also predictability. So today, the money will be available through a pocket. We've been promised 23 billion. There have been pledges here. But
will it come?
Will it come?
When will it come?
When will it come? Will it be adequate? And these are the fundamental questions that we are asking as we go to COP28. And therefore, there is going to be a discussion around a new quantified goal on finance. And it's because we didn't achieve the 100 billion. So yes, there's a skewness of countries that are accessing much more financial flows and adequacy than others. And so the whole issue of equity comes into play. Where is that money going to? When we are told we are getting 23 billion, what is it going to be? What sectors is it going to address? They are very climate-sensitive sectors. We have suffered through COVID-19 period on the tourism sector. A very sensitive sector that has been supporting a huge socio-economic and social development, population around this country. We are talking about drought and livestock loss. We are also now talking about a new funding for losses and damage. And I'm really waiting to hear what Idris will say about that. And again, we have been locked in a whole year discussing the infrastructure, the institutional setup of a fund that is actually an emergency fund that's required to respond to the needs of a humanitarian response. So really, for me, that's where we are caught up. And we really need institutions such as the ones Dr. Kariuki is working in to provide solutions that are suited to the African continent and African needs to respond to the climate change.
But Cecilia, I still feel like we've been reduced just to a point where we talk about it, but we have nothing tangible. Even now, the 100 billion was committed to 14 years ago. Now we are saying, okay, so bring the money. Is that all we can do? Because it's not been brought for 14 years. So even if we say it now, even going into COP28, that we need that money, it should come here, how do we ensure that it actually comes? Is there a level of holding the nations to account where the money has come from? Is it so that we can point out that out of the 100 billion, this is what has been brought, this is how it has been used? Or are we just reduced to asking for it, and that's all we can do?
The multilateral process becomes a little bit painful because it's all about trust. You promised, you never delivered. We are moving into another COP28. We'll be moving to COP29, COP30, where there are promises that were never met. So actually what we try to do through the multilateral process is to try and rebuild trust.
Yeah.
And trust can only be rebuilt when commitments and promises are met.
Okay.
And that's where we are at.
Okay. Nasra, so I don't know whether you see this the way I'm looking at it. The accountability system is a problem because now even once you say that, okay, give us this money, you had promised you'll bring it. So COP29 will come, they haven't done it. Do we say the same thing again? That we, again, COP28, we asked you for the 100 billion, we're asking for it again now. Should there be a way that accountability systems is done? And what would that be?
Thank you so much. I think, in my opinion, that's also why then you have a lot of disengagement and dissatisfaction when it comes to the civil society and activists around Africa, because I think they hear a lot of talk, and unfortunately, they see talk from men in suits.
Yeah.
They are not that. They're not part of it, so they feel excluded. So my opinion would be that, by and large, we've had some challenges with the declaration, that's granted, but we are where we are. So, one, I would, recommend these civil society groups and activists to come up with 3 or 4 things they want between now and COP and make sure that they then complement the declaration, because that way, then you can hold someone accountable at COP. And then separately, I feel the other thing we need to do is what commitments were made and what has been achieved. I think having a tracker would help us understand whether we're repeating the same message each year or have we fulfilled anything. And not just internationally, but from a local capacity and a regional capacity. So we need to look at our tracker in a global context, in a regional context with the AU, and then locally, I would break it down to 2 tiers actually, national governments and subnational governments. So what is it that we're doing in all those levels, and are we moving in the right direction? Because if we can't track these things, then it's, as Cecilia said, we're moving every year. It's almost like a milestone ceremonial thing that we're doing rather than actually addressing the problem and creating impact.
Yeah, and Idris, something that Cecilia wanted you to talk about, the new funding for losses and damage. Something that is going to cause a lot of damages is the El Nino. Yeah. The Kenya Meteorological Department says we have a 99% chance this is happening in October. Are you ready for it? And then also you can comment on the issue of new funding for losses and damage.
The question should be, are we ready for it as a country?
Yeah.
So maybe a few preliminary issues. One, the worst impact of climate change is in extreme weather events. I think the last, since 1970s, there has been a 5-time increase in extreme weather events. Floods, droughts, heat waves, and related disasters. So that's the first main issue that we have to remember. So even as we discuss the concept of climate change, for us it's not a theoretical abstract issue. We're dealing with the consequences every day. We have communities that were facing drought, haven't recovered from drought, and now they're going to the next shock, which is floods. But there is hope in this. Despite the fact that there is a 5-time increase in the frequency of extreme weather events, there is a 3rd reduction in the total number of deaths relating from these events the same period. Why? Because of strong multi-hazard warning systems that exist in different parts of the world. However, the challenge is that for developing countries, including Africa, we have the least developed mechanisms for early warning system. We have the least infrastructure for weather and hydrological observation. We have the least, policies and architecture for linking early warning finance with early warning itself. That's the second preliminary question. Now, the third one, to bring us to the issue of the current floods, we have a good lead time, a number of weeks. The Kenya Meteorological Department has given very good data around where rainfall is highly likely to be the highest, possibly resulting in flooding. We have that data. We have the data that we need to use on past historical flooding that we can use for planning, and that mechanism has already been activated, the mechanism for preparedness, prepositioning, especially at a level, institutional level of the Kenya Red Cross. We're working on prepositioning, we are working with communities on early warning messages, we are working with county governments on taking simple local level community actions, including clearing of drainages. So the preparatory questions are taking place. The question of can we be ready enough to ensure that there is no death, there is no destruction, almost impossible. The government right now is coordinating both intersectoral at the leadership at the national level, national government, but also is coordinating with the county government. So there's been strong processes that have been put in place for that level of coordination. But it brings us to the question of financing. There's very little money available for early action interventions globally. I think most of the resources available wait for the issues to get out of hand. We wait for the numbers of displaced to be higher. We wait for the numbers of the dead to be, to reach a certain threshold before resources are unlocked.
Isn't that where the problem is? Because we know now that next month there's going to be an El Nino.
That is exactly where the problem is. So globally speaking, we have an issue. Within the Global Red Cross Society, for example, more recently we have launched availing of resources based on anticipatory information, based on early warning information. But that resource is very little to have any meaningful impact. And our concern as an institution that works with communities to both prepare for and respond to emergencies is if we continue on the current track in terms of the resources available for preparedness, we will be caught flat-footed. But we are working with a number of the institutions to address that.
Because it's unfortunate, and is it exacerbating even for you that we know for sure next month I'll have you here talking about damages and losses that will happen. And one of the declarations was operationalize the loss and damage facility agreed on COP27. Precisely. So if that was operationalized, what difference would it make?
So the loss and damage mechanism is based on a very simple principle. One, developed countries should avail resources for adaptation, including the work we are doing for preparedness, for response, for recovery. I think that's the fundamental principle. And it's justified by the fact that Africa and other developing countries that are the victims of these disasters, these extreme weather events, are the least contributors to the source of the problem. As long as these resources are not available, as long as the loss and damage facility will continue to be an empty basket, the challenge we are discussing right now will be perennial. We will not be having resources to help institutions such as Kenya Red Cross to help communities to deal with the effects of climate change. But the second and more important one, what we have to remember is that the discussion on loss and damage, the discussion on climate finance has moved from being a question of charity. I think for a long time we've confused the availability of resources as a charity question. Right now, if you look at the Nairobi Declaration, if you look at the arguments of developing countries of the last number of years, the reorganization of the system, the use of Africa's natural resources to, create a value, an economic value, and by extension, money that can be moved here. The specific proposals that has been put on the table, including debt for loss and damage relief, meaning that, our debts are forgiven based on the obligations that the countries have for loss and damage. So there are serious proposals on the table to operationalize the loss and damage facility. But this relies on goodwill and the political goodwill of the developed countries. And all we can hope for is, as we engage in this global diplomatic, climate diplomacy, that more resources will be availed under the loss and damage schemes. Okay.
Dr. Kariuki, there's a proposal in the Nairobi Declaration for an overhaul of the world's debt financing system. In fact, part of it is inclusion of a debt pause clause, extension of sovereign debt maturity period, granting of a 10-year grace period. But how will that impact the interventions on the ground? Because there are no guarantees that even if that is done, then the available resources will then trickle down. Because there is no guarantee from any institution that, okay, if you're given a debt pause for 10 years, what you would have paid as interest will then do this particular project.
Okay, I think the way to answer your question, Trevor, is to look at the current state of our economies on the continent. Let me focus on Africa. What you find is that today, a lot of African economies are under debt distress, significant debt distress. And what that means is that there's less resources available for funding national programs, etc., etc. So what we are saying is, and now you add the additional complexity caused by climate change. And so what we are saying is that climate change, just to give you a statistic, today already African countries sort of bear up between $7 and $15 billion every year on account of climate change, to address the impact of climate change, and a figure that could go up to $50 billion by 2040. So what we are saying is that if countries need to be able to meet their development aspirations, meet their development programs, they need more resources. And therefore, there needs to be maybe tweaking or changes in the climate finance, in the global financing, in order to be able to give some form of relief to countries that are already burdened by the existing challenges. We just came out from COVID. It had significant impact. There is the current issue of Russia and Ukraine, has significant impact. So what we are saying is that let us find ways of giving relief to countries so that they have additional headroom or capacity to be able to finance their ongoing programs. So, for example, what you will see is that unless that happens, you will just be adding burden or more financial burden to already people who have significant, who have very limited capacity to be able to lend because of the existing challenges, and most of which are based on externalities that are beyond their control. Yeah. COVID, climate change, the issue in the supply chain disruptions because of what is going on between Russia and Ukraine, etc., etc.
Yeah. Cecilia, what are your thoughts on the debt restructuring? And then there's another one of carbon tax. Is that the direction we should take?
I think these are instruments that are available for us on the table.
Yeah.
Instruments for me that African countries still need to interrogate and to see how best they can be suited to dealing with our current issues. Indeed, as Idris has mentioned, the response to climate change, just as we are doing with the SDGs, has a lot of times been viewed as being more of a charitable, more of grants, rather than looking at other viable instruments that would be more sustainable in terms of responding. Because a grant is given by a donor who really just wants to give some kind of charity. Yeah. But we need to start looking at some of these viable instruments. And therefore, for me, they are they are responses. I was in South Africa for a couple of years, and I worked with them in the development of their own carbon tax instrument. Unfortunately, it's not an instrument that has grown to be able to be a major response to their climate change challenge, and mainly because, again, it's determined by how well structured it is in order for it to redirect resources to addressing climate. Yeah. We know that climate, the way it's described even within our own national development planning, in many countries, there are no ministries of climate per se. And therefore, it is a cross-cutting issue. And therefore, when you go to start unpacking a national budget to understand where are these resources going towards being directed to address an infrastructural need, whether it's green buildings, whether it's building of a bridge, whether it's building of an infrastructure facility that requires to respond to climate change, a lot of times it will be categorized as a public works measure. And therefore, that's where we are not determining how do we actually trace, even domestically, the flow of resources, and whether it's a debt swap that it has actually gone to address a climate change need. So there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of us having a framework, whether in terms of macroeconomics or in budgeting, to be able to respond to this. So in essence, what does that mean? Article 6 was one of the final instruments of the Paris Agreement that was reached agreement in COP26. And again, we are seeing a need for unpacking what that means in terms of looking at non-monetary and also monetary responses to climate change. And for me, this is where my big question goes to in financial institutions and development banks in terms of them really, and yesterday I was in this conference and the young children came and said, we were in the matatu yesterday and they were talking about carbon markets. What does that mean and how can we interpret that for a day-to-day person to know that that's not something that's going to put more burden on an individual? It will not increase the taxation that they are already suffering from in terms of addressing something that has been caused by an externality or by another country or by historical injustices. So for me, the whole issue of debt restructuring, looking at carbon tax should not be seen as a punishment, but it should be seen within a package of ensuring that there is economic and social justices to those that are already suffering from the brunt of climate change.
Now that you've dealt with this firsthand, Cecilia, what does a carbon tax mean, and how would it look like? Is it for countries, and what is it pegged on?
I think that's a very good question, Trevor. You know, I think when we talk about carbon tax, is it about punishing those that the polluter pays it, or is it seen as something that one needs to contribute to address an issue that was caused by somebody else? And it goes again back to the UN Convention, Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that's why we still talk so much, and you will hear this over and over again as we move toward COP28, the whole issue of equity. You know, why am I paying for a problem that I really did not cause? But I'm being asked to make a contribution to go back to my own package and really contribute a percentage of something that I did not cause. There is a second principle within the convention, which is the common but differentiated responsibility, which means that even now when we are talking about the 100 billion, I talked about trust. But I also we need to look backwards on the historical injustices, but again, not dwell too much on it, but look forward. Because the whole issue of Africa and developing countries being able to leapfrog and being able to avoid the pathways that were taken by most of the industrialized countries being an opportunity for us. And for me, that's the bottom line of the carbon tax. That the carbon tax needs not to be seen as something that's punitive, but it needs to be seen as an incentive to take action.
Okay, so the one you worked on, was it for individuals? Was it for organizations? Is it for institutions? Do you pay like the pay as you earn so that everybody knows that this is what we've paid in terms of carbon tax and therefore this is the project it's going to? Or is it per country?
I think that's where the debate is. I think when President Trudeau talked about this, this
carbon tax.
Yes, international carbon tax, that's where the fundamental question is coming. Is an issue of national sovereignty in terms of how it is defined and described, but it's also an issue of collective responsibility. And that's where we need to go into a debate. I think having been in the multilateral process, then that's where the question comes. And when we start describing and discussing it, then there are questions to ask on who should be paying who.
Pay what and at what
and who
point.
should be paying what, what amount, and where does the responsibility lie.
And Nasra, how would that work for you in terms of carbon tax? So say they decide that if somebody doesn't have a green building, then their taxes are this much, or if you're building, this is the tax. What would you recommend? Because it's still out there. Is it a country thing? Is it an individual thing so that we all see it in our pay slips? What happens?
So right now, I think a lot is up in the air because they were not clear on the direction of this carbon tax. My understanding was that, one, as Cecilia mentioned, it's a polluter pay-driven initiative.
But we all pollute in one way.
Right, exactly. And then second, there was also the conversation around that these rich countries, what they can charge for their carbon sinks. Is it like $100 for 10, is it 1 or 10 kilogram ton of CO2 versus Africa, where we only charge $10. So it's like a relatively cheaper way of trading in carbon for Africa. So I think it's almost equalizing that discussion. But, to come back to green buildings, we would have to unpack what that means in the context of how many, if you build green, you're saving on, your carbon.
Get a tax relief
right.
or not.
And in fact, that was the conversation we were having at a pre-Africa Climate Summit event with the county governor of Nairobi, where we were asking, as an industry essentially, why is doing the right thing so hard? We need help and incentives from governments to make it easier to do the right thing, because the right thing is the smart thing, but we need that enabling environment. So one of the things that he was proposing was that approval time might be shorter because you've gone through a lot more. And then second, perhaps looking at tax waivers. So these are things which are, being discussed, but I'd be curious to see how it's unpacked from a carbon perspective. Thank you.
Okay, Idris, what would you recommend? How would this look like? Because it's still a debate that is out there for everyone to just chime in.
It's a series of combination of instruments.
Yeah.
I think it is not a focus on one instrument or the other. I think that's the general recommendation and it's the right direction. The discussion on carbon sinks is relatively interesting, and carbon sinks, carbon tax, relatively interesting. The science around it is still under debate. The metrics to be used, the standards to be used are still under debate. And that's why there's huge confusion on this. But that confusion should not last perennially. I think that's the important message, that at one point in time, there should be a conclusion on how communities can be compensated for their contribution to reduction of carbon emissions. I think that's the first one. And second, related to it, is a costing mechanism for those who pollute. And that's the other discussion. What that instrument will look like, or series of instruments, is another thing. And as I said before, it requires political will. Whether it's the loss and damage facility is one. Whether it is to pay Africa and developing countries for their carbon sink capacities at market value, whatever the market metric will look like, is another. The third one will be generally resources to be available to assist the weakest members, the most vulnerable members of the community, to be able to deal with the impacts of it. But where we sit as the Red Cross, at the end of the day, as we make this discussion and these debates almost academic, we have to remember that at the end of it, they're vulnerable people. There is a mother somewhere who has to walk hundreds of kilometers every other day to collect water. Yeah. There is huge mortality and morbidity rates resulting from the impacts of climate change. So when we decide to reduce and find a solution to this eventually, it has to be workable, and it has to be centered around the victims of climate change, who are the poorest and most vulnerable members of the world.
Yeah, and Dr. Kariuki, you're the banker in this, so how would this be structured ideally?
No, I think I'll try and give it almost a natural, sort of a more simple way. I think the first form of carbon tax that I came across was in UK, where London actually introduced a carbon tax, which was aimed at discouraging or deterring people driving into the city, because because of the amount of emissions that will result. It was part of the fuel bill, and the idea was here that, look, try and do carpooling or use public transport systems to be able to get into the city, so that you try and reduce the amount of emissions that were being experienced in the city of London. So that is at maybe I would say at a city level. But at the international level, there are already a number of these type of mechanisms. There's the so-called carbon tax adjustment mechanism that is being introduced in Europe, I believe, in 2024, 2026. And the idea here is that all produce from abroad that gets into Europe has to demonstrate that it is fairly neutral from an emission, a carbon footprint perspective. And what that means is that, as Cecilia was saying, it's a sort of a punitive tax. Yeah. So, for example, if your country, let's give, for example, a country like South Africa, which exports about 40% of its vehicles to Europe, the fact that it is a highly carbon-intensive industry, because South Africa has probably one of the highest what I would call carbon footprint, in the sense that the bulk of its generation stems from coal-fired generation. What it means is that vehicles that will be getting into Europe from South Africa will be surcharged a certain amount to sort of recognize the fact that there has been a significant amount of emissions in the production of those vehicles. I thought that I'll give sort of those kind of examples, because those are examples that maybe the viewers would probably relate with. Or if, for example, our flowers here in Kenya. Kenya is largely renewable. I think Kenya today is about 90% renewable as far as power production is concerned. So that now will favor flowers maybe from Kenya, as opposed to flowers that will come from a country that has a higher carbon footprint compared to Kenya. So I think that's how internationally it will work. Of course, there are areas such as the maritime. I think that was also mentioned. Unknown to many is that maritime shipping is a significant polluter, because almost all ships use either HFO or diesel for purposes of propulsion. But this eventually will become even more extreme, because I do believe that come 2035, countries like Europe will actually stop importation of any they'll ban what do you call it, internal combustion engines that are based on fossil fuels. Let me stop there.
And this is another issue, Cecilia, because there's a proposal to accelerate the phasing down of coal and abolishment of all fossil fuel subsidies. But there's always been a debate on the job losses that come with that. Where do you draw the balance now?
Yeah, I think this boils down to what I'd mentioned earlier. And it's all about the just transitions. We are asking countries such as South Africa that are highly dependent on coal to face down coal. That's what we said in Glasgow. Of course, there is more ambition about not just facing down, but facing out. And what we are hoping as we move towards COP28 is to see much more commitment towards that. But basically, that must be it must be qualified with something else. Because if you say a certain area, let's look at South Africa, Mpumalanga is an area where they're highly dependent on coal. As an industry, it's the basis of job creation. It's the basis that ensures the children go to school. It's the basis that ensures communities have access to health facilities, etc. So if you face down or face out, what does this mean in terms of the livelihoods of the people that are living in these areas? So what we are saying, and we've been looking at various initiatives, global initiatives that has been put in place. South Africa has been having what they call their Just Energy Transition Program. It's also in Indonesia. And we're trying to understand what kind of framework would be relevant for countries that we are asking to transition. Because transition is inevitable. But as we are saying, it has to be coupled with a socioeconomic development solution to ensure that the families, the communities that would remain vulnerable to this level of face down are taken care of.
And Idris, let me bring you back on this. And you may not necessarily be dealing with the coal directly, but there's transitions that you're dealing with. Because even right now, the recommendations to the people who are living in the low grounds that El Nino is coming, move to higher ground. But they don't own land in those higher grounds. So how do you ensure that this transition happens in a just way without making other communities vulnerable?
So by the way, and this is an excellent point, the question of just transitions is not just for developed countries. It is also includes for developing countries. We have to target small-scale farmers. We have to target individuals whose livelihoods are based and really linked to the environment and to weather patterns to be able to adapt to and transition from reliance, on the more unreliable sources of livelihoods to more reliable ones. And that's we have to work, all of us have to work with the communities on that. Second and closely related, I think for us also as a country, is it's the question of diversification of our energy sources. And it's a question that we should also be committed to as developing countries. We are the least in terms of contribution for fossil emissions, but we can be part of the solution. Africa and generally developing countries is home to almost 40% of the sources of renewable energy, but attracts just 2% of the total investment in renewable energy. So we should be working with finance institutions to put more money, more resources on putting up infrastructure for renewable energy that will avail the required energy, including for developing countries to phase out. But the question of phasing out for transition again boils down to what? Political commitment.
Yeah.
Okay, and that is what is lacking globally. Phasing out completely for coal, reduction of fossil-based other carbon sources, generally speaking, petrol and so on, will be reliable if we make the technology cheaper. And that technology, as we speak, is not cheap. It is not cheap because the demand for it is also low, so the capital required, we're not making use of the advantages built into, bigger supply, bigger demand. Yeah. And all this has to be created. It has to be policy-driven. It has to be culture change-driven at a personal level, at a household level, and at a country level. Yeah. As an institution, as the Red Cross, we're working with livelihood patterns of communities so that we can make it easier for them to transition. And we'll continue putting partnerships whose target to achieve that.
And this is where the problem is, Idris, because practically speaking, again, back to the El Nino, because this is the disaster that we're facing in the next few months. It's just about a month now. In Nyando, for example, we know the floods are coming. Yeah. When you tell people to move to higher ground and they tell you, I don't own land there, what do you tell them?
Yeah, exactly that. I think you require people to move away from their livelihoods without, having alternatives. It reduces the choices people have in early action. And I think you hit the nail on the head. One of the main challenges then we will be facing, both in terms of the public authorities, the government, institutions such as the Kenya Red Cross, but generally as a country, is how do we support the least, the most vulnerable members of our communities come up with and develop alternative livelihood options. When we give the warning, by the way, the early warning information, it's a combination of factors that lead to perhaps individuals not acting on it. One is availability of other options. That's the first one and is the main one. The second one is just around our culture for risk management. I'm always want to say as a joke, our risk appetite is much higher, but meaning that our risk management strategies are not really built on early warning information. Okay, so there is huge doubt, for example, at some level on early warning information. Yeah.
Even now, there are people who doubt
even now, yes,
coming
exactly. Even now, there are people who will ask you the question of whether you are God or not. But that requires a general. It just requires a general culture change. It requires greater investment in public education about how early warning systems work. The science of early warning itself, the science of focusing, and so on. And finally, at the end of the day, if we are not making resources available for people to exercise those options of early action, for me to be able to go to higher grounds, for me to move with my family, live my livelihood options without necessarily facing the risk of, dying of hunger. If those options are created, I think many people will be acting on the early warning information.
Okay. There's a reaction from some of the activists on this whole conversation that we are having. Let's listen to what the activists had to say.
Time as a result of climate change. And we finally had an opportunity to visit the doctor. And when we did, no prescription was given. Instead, we were given painkillers as a temporary fix. And here we are yet again. When will the story end?
The declaration is silent about reforming the system, the structures that made a whole continent, 55 countries, get only $33 billion, yet one country whose presence was very visible in this summit, that country, the United States, got $118 billion worth of SDRs.
Nasra, how do you ensure this is more inclusive? Of course, you can't include everybody, but how do you ensure that this conversation around climate change is inclusive, including the young actors, the activists, everybody, so that we all have a concerted effort towards dealing with it?
Thank you so much. And firstly, thank you for asking me this question. I think in the first instance, perception is as important as action. So I think one of the key challenges with the Africa Climate Summit was at some point there was a perception that it was the West pushing their agenda on Africans. And by that happening already, there was already a sense of fear with Africans not being part of this conversation in a way that is going to drive the solution. Going forward, this has been done, but going forward between now and COP, what we need to make sure is it's Africans who are facilitating these discussions, not any foreign entity guiding Africans on their conversations. I think that is what we need to change between now and COP, one. Two, in terms of inclusivity, I think, as I said earlier on, SMEs are a key driver of the African conversation. The built environment is a key aspect that was overlooked in this conversation. What can we do different to ensure 200 million Africans and how they are not included in conversations that are affecting their right to living with dignity is rectified between now and then? My take is we urgently need to have conversations and working groups with respect to SMEs, youth, women, sectors that were not included in the declaration, so that we can complement the declaration in time for COP. Because if we don't do that, we will have a lot of hostility, which will be building up, and resentment. And I think we have a real opportunity to say, well, this is where we are. What do we do to rectify it? To get it to a point where it has more buy-in from those who've been left behind to ensure we have the Africa we want in time for COP.
And Cecilia, speaking of cementing our views, do we have now a unified voice heading into COP28? Because there were also concerns that ECOWAS was not heard, SADC was not heard. Now she's talking about SMEs and young people. Do we now have a unified voice in your view, or what more should we do to galvanize our voice as Africa?
I think the legitimacy of the climate change multilateral process is anchored in inclusion. And if the voices, particularly of those that are vulnerable, is not at the table, then definitely, the outcomes that we will be having, whether it's at COP28, whether it's at the Africa Climate Summit, whether it's in any other regional platform, then they won't be viable. We, as a UNFCCC, I think we are one of the largest COPs, multilateral process, really. We are seeing over 70,000, 100,000 people coming to our COP. We also face a COP that has the highest level of people that come to express themselves. I don't want to call them demonstrators, because these are people that feel that they are, they're highly infected and they want to pass a message. We are inclusive. It's actually legal to be at the COP and to come and air your views in any format that you want to. And I think for me, inclusion is really at the bottom line. And the legitimacy of our process will be anchored on that. I was in various sessions at the Africa Climate Summit. The young people, the children, came and they were saying, you are not offering us a space at the table. We want the solutions that you are providing, the discussions that you are having. If we are not included, we are 70% of the Africa population. If you're crafting solutions that don't include us, then you are just wasting your time. And I think this is a viable argument. And it's not just an argument, it is a must. And we must bring everybody at the table. Different views, different perspectives. Having been in the negotiations, I now know how to really respect different viewpoints. And it's a process. It's about political will, but it's also about listening, acting, including. For me, it's really a bottom line, and it's not negotiable. Let's allow people to say what they want to do, and let them be part of the solution.
All right, Dr. Kariuki, how do we foster this inclusion as we're winding up on this? And I'd come to all of you for a 1-minute closing remark. Okay,
I think from my perspective, I think we should not be overcritical. In my view, and I must congratulate the organizers of this Africa Climate Summit. I genuinely do believe that there was a significant level of inclusiveness. I know of 2 very significant youth events that took place. I know I personally engaged extensively with significant CSOs on the continent. So I think from that perspective, it was inclusive. But I think there was also the issue that was raised regarding what I alluded to earlier, the flows of climate finance. And it is true. And this is a function of the complexity and the bureaucracies that are associated with the existing climate finance architecture. That is something that must be redesigned to make it, what Cecilia mentioned, I forgot one word, to facilitate access, to ensure there's adequate climate finance, and most importantly, to ensure that the climate finance that is available is also affordable. But beyond the Africa Climate Summit, we are on the road to COP28 in Dubai. Yeah. And what we do is that the declaration that was made provides the framework within which the Africa group of negotiators, and I say this because I know for a fact that because we support the Africa group of negotiators, will now sit and drill those declarations and see how do we want to advance Africans' case position on the various issues. So I think let us not be overcritical. I think as Cecilia will accept, the UNFCCC process, the COP is not an event. Is actually a process. So it evolves over time. For example, in COP26, we talked about doubling of climate adaptation. So last year we had the global stock, we had the loss and damage. This year is the global stocktake as is the centerpiece. So I think it's a process, and let's not be overcritical. And what we need to do is to now allow the Africa group of negotiators to now drill the issues, the declarations that have been made, and come up with pragmatic solutions towards Africa's problems.
Okay. Idris, or inclusivity?
Well, as an institution, as the Kenya Red Cross, will be working with local communities to scale up their local action to respond to the climate crisis. I think that is our commitment to the future. But at the international level, as we prepare for the COP28 and as a member of the International Federation of the Red Cross, we will be calling on governments all over the world, to mobilize the political goodwill and to put into action the commitments that were made in previous COPs and to make COP28 have real, meaningful impact on the lives of the most vulnerable globally.
All right. Let me bring in some feedback really quick, and then I'll give you all a minute for closing remarks on this conversation. Let's bring that up at Trevor Mbija at Citizen TV Kenya. Use the hashtag Daybreak. Let's read that real quick on screen, and then I'll give you a minute each for closing remarks. Brian Chemwa says African continent should invest in public transportation, promote electric vehicles, and develop policies that reduce the carbon footprint of the transportation sector. Global coordination commitment is also essential to combat this global issue. All right? Babu Michael says there's been previous declarations and now Nairobi declaration. The most important thing is making the declaration come true. With the funds promised during the past declarations, is there any way we can compel the global north on this? Okay? I also hope that the spirit of embracing Pan-African solidarity, putting people before profit and harnessing our unique position in history and vast renewable energy potential will soar high, benefiting Africa all the more. Okay? Remy Butia says we need to move swiftly from high-level policy discourse to tangible actions where it matters on the ground. Whilst commitments at the highest levels must be secured, direct business-to-business engagement is imperative. Okay? Okelo Mwalimu says, I'm thrilled about resolutions made by African heads of state at Africa Climate Summit. I liked eloquence with which they expressed dissatisfaction with how Africa is treated by developed countries. However, they must display the same at COP28. Their confidence and eloquence shouldn't fizzle out. Okay? Ibrahim Bakari says, if Nairobi Declaration won't be followed to the letter, county and climate change push to be a wild goose chase. Okay? And Godi Baraza says the Nairobi Declaration should by all means act as the guiding light towards a credible environmental healing. All right, Cecilia, closing remarks, 1 minute.
Well, for me, really, a consensual, common Africa position anchored on the issues that are key for Africa and are central to moving us to the next level of development and sustainable development will be crucial. Okay. Let Africans come together and let them come to COP28 united with a common position that they're all prepared to fight for on the table, and that will bring transformation to the vulnerable communities.
Dr. Kariuki?
I think I'll start by saying that for sure the global stocktake that is going to take place this year will show that we are off track on the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. So it's imperative that the commitment to reduce emissions by 43% by what I would say is the global north must be adhered to. And that means that on our part as a continent, we must refocus and channel our energies on developing the adaptive capacity for Africa and resilience. Because, as I said earlier, we expect that climate change is locked in for the next 20 years, and we expect these extreme weather events to continue happening. So I think there's no choice that we have to enhance our adaptive capacity to climate change.
All right, Nasra?
So for me, the Nairobi Declaration was an important first step. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it symbolizes Africa taking charge of its narrative, and that's crucial. So between now and COP, whether you are not featured, whether you're not happy, this is your chance to say, no complaining, let's take action. Africa deserves it, you deserve it, we all do. So let's show up at COP with better solutions for a unified Africa. Thank you.
Idris?
The debate may be grand, but the action required are very simple. Let's move the commitments to action, put vulnerable people at the center of this debate. Let's just remember that.
All right. Thank you all for making time this morning. Dr. Kevin Kariuki, Vice President, Power, Energy, Climate, Green Growth at the African Development Bank. Cecilia Kinuthia-Njenga, Director, Intergovernmental Support in UNFCCC, that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Dr. Ahmed Idris, Secretary General, Kenya Red Cross, and Nasra Nanda, CEO, Kenya Green Building Society. Thank you all for making time this morning for that very engaging conversation. We're taking a quick break. When you come back, it's time for Cooking Tips, all right? My name is Trevor Mbija. Always a pleasure seeing you here. Bye for now.